Hello, my name is Aiden, and this is our presentation on bread. During this presentation, we will be covering the role and impact of yeast and sugar, the role and impact of salt, the steps involved in baking, and the outcomes of the different variables. To start, some characteristics of yeast are that it feeds on sugar when it's activated, it releases CO2 and the bread rises, and if there's no sugar involved, then it makes lean bread. Sugar, on the other hand, provides a better flavor for the bread, provides the fuel for the yeast, and it provides structure so that the bread doesn't crumble apart. Fermentation is the chemical process that typically takes place in baking. What are the properties of salt? Well, salt provides better flavor, it limits the multiplication of yeast, strengthens the structure of bread, and it protects the sugar that's in the dough. These are the ingredients of the recipe that we'll be using for our experiment. To start, you need 4.5 to 5 cups of unbleached flour, 1 tablespoon of granulated sugar, 2 1/4 teaspoons of instant yeast, 2.5 teaspoons of salt, 1 2/3 cup of water, 90 to 110 Fahrenheit, and yellow cornmeal. However, the 2.5 teaspoons of salt will vary between the two variables. These are the first 5 steps to the process of the recipe. To start, you have to measure out the 4.5 cups of flour into the bowl. Then, you have to mix in the rest of the ingredients and stir them all together. After you stir for around 6 to 7 minutes, you take the dough out and knead it over some flour. This will help the dough to stick together better. If you would like, instead of hand kneading it, you could use a mixer. Once the dough is fully kneaded, you want to put the dough into a vegetable oil greased bowl and cover it with plastic wrap. Then, you wait 1.5 to 2 hours for the bread to rise. So this is day 2 of the experiment, and we just finished having the bread with no salt rise, and this is what it looks like. And my first observations are that it hasn't risen like nearly as much as the other one. The other one rose like a lot. It was almost like double, maybe even triple the size that it was when we put it in. But this one just looks like it's risen like maybe an inch or two. Yeah, it hasn't really risen that much. There's still all the crumbles around on the cutting board, but overall, it also smells a little bit. It doesn't smell very good, but overall, there aren't too many changes aside from the consistency and the lack of rising from the bread. The next few steps are fairly simple. For the next step in the process, you have to deflate the risen dough. This is done by lightly pressing into it, not hard enough to flatten it, but hard enough to get the excess air out of the dough. After that, you want to fold the dough similar to the way you would fold an envelope. Once you fold the dough, you want to place the dough on a baking sheet. Before you place it though, you should sprinkle corn flour over the baking sheet. That way, the dough won't stick to it when it gets put in the oven. After putting them on the baking sheet, you want to leave the loaves to rise once more for around 45 minutes and then preheat the oven to 450 degrees Fahrenheit before putting the loaves in. Steps 11 through 15 consist of fairly simple steps. The first one being creating steam. By creating steam in the oven, you can increase the crunchiness of the bread and make it more dense in the middle. To do this, you need to put boiling water in a tray and put the tray under the tray that you're putting the bread on. Next, you want to place it in the oven with the bread. After 20 to 25 minutes, the bread will turn a nice golden brown color. After you bake the bread, you want to let it sit for about an hour, and then the final step is to enjoy. So we just took our unsalted bread out of the oven. We cut it up, we got some olive oil and stuff like that, some spices, and we cut it up, divided it between us three, and we're all gonna give our opinions. In my opinion, this is really good. Honestly, it's arguably better than the other loaf, which is surprising. You would think that the unsalted bread would take away from a lot of like the flavor and the consistency of it, but honestly, it has like the perfect consistency on the inside. It's almost like angel bread. Also, just the making process of the bread was just so much harder than the other bread because of how much it would crumble and how hard it was to knead. However, it really paid off in the end. This is delicious. This is arguably better than the other one. Lean bread is bread that excludes sugar, so the yeast will have to use starch as fuel instead. During this experiment, there were multiple similarities and differences between the salt and the unsalted bread. One similarity was that both of the breads had very crunchy crust. Taking it out of the oven, the crust was very firm, but when we cut it up and ate it, it was perfectly normal. Now, a difference between the two is during the assembly process when we were kneading the dough, the without salt bread was much more crumbly. The bread that we made with salt, almost no crumble at all, and there was almost no cracking. Whereas without the salt, it was breaking apart really easily, and there were a lot of crumbs remaining on the cutting board after we finished. Another similarity is both pieces of bread were dense. Finally, they both tasted great. These are some of the key takeaways you need to get from this experiment. To start, fermentation is a chemical process that occurs. Second, yeast feeds on sugar. However, when there is no sugar present, it can use starch instead. Next, both sugar and salt provide structure to the bread. Next, salt is necessary. It slows the yeast down. And finally, lean bread is a result of the excluding sugar from the process.